Authentic versus fictional self. What am I talking about? Because human beings are social, we all develop the need to have a sense of who we are and who others are. This helps us decide who is safe, who is risky, and whom we ought to avoid. We use these notions to respond to our contexts and to predict how others might respond in their contexts. We also entertain numerous notions of how people ought to behave and to what degree we all fail to conform to our conscious and unconscious standards. In this process, we unintentionally and deliberately adopt concepts that define human nature in general, concerning specific others, and of course, as to ourselves. This helps us adopt the strategies we hope will work in our day-to-day challenges. But do you really know who you are? Are you completely comfortable being you? Are you living as your authentic self, or might you be stuck in a partially misshapen fictional self? When I talk about the authentic self versus the fictional self, I'm referring to our understanding of who we are at our deepest core. I'm talking about how the person we think we are shapes the way we express ourselves while relating to ourselves and to others. This is our core identity, what we commonly call self-image. Although it may not seem obvious at first, our sense of self includes both who we are irrespective of others, as well as who we are compared and contrasted with others. So, what is meant by the term authentic self? The authentic self is who we actually are at our essence. To be our authentic selves includes being in touch with several things, such as our genuine thoughts, our actual feelings, and our honest desires. Our authentic self is who we would believe ourselves to be had we not been led astray by external controlling influences such as arbitrary social constructs or domineering societal expectations. When we are in touch with our authentic self, we are more precisely self-aware, more self-accepting, and we enjoy the freedom to live in genuine alignment with our personal values and beliefs. There are several regular behaviors correlated with the authentic self. Those who embrace a more authentic self find it easier to be honest with themselves. They are also truthful and reasonably transparent in their thoughts, actions, and interactions with others. They express themselves honestly, without pretense or the pressure to conform to societal norms and expectations. When we live in our authentic self, we have a significant sense of self-worth and a confidence that clearly understands we are just as worthy as others without having to be just like them. We recognize our strengths and weaknesses realistically, without exaggeration, bragging, being uncomfortable, or feeling inadequate. I should add that if at times you feel inadequate to life, it is usually because you focus on lies you have come to believe about yourself and in some way have experienced distortions to your core identity. And that keeps you from seeing your actual dignity and high value. To know our authentic self means being aware of our emotions while having the ability to adequately embrace and regulate them. People in touch with their authentic selves come across as emotionally intelligent, They're also able to navigate most relationships and challenges, feeling adequate to life, and usually being quite calm. Living in alignment with our authentic self allows us to more efficiently pursue our passions and goals. On the other hand, the fictional self is an imagined identity that deviates from our authentic self to an unknown degree. Somehow, along the way, we lost touch with who we really are. The fictional self is not who we really are, but rather who we fear we really are. Moreover, it is often a sense of self we hide from others. We might have a painful fear that others will see us in our raw unacceptability. When we live as a fictional self, it is because various overbearing external influences, such as societal pressures, caretaker expectations, or the pressure to fit in and conform, psychologically, this disfigured our core identity. Most of that damage is minor, but for some of us, that damage is traumatic and significantly dysfunctional. Not all external influences are bad. We need external influences, but domineering external influences have the potential to mask our authentic self and displace it. The fictional self often adopts a persona or facade that misrepresents our true thoughts, our emotions, our values. The persona of the fictional self keeps us from realizing we're living a lie due to acquired insecurities, fears, and psychological disfigurement. This keeps us from considering choices that could be more useful. We've come to presume the truth about us is just too unacceptable. The fictional self also displays several identifiable regular behaviors. The fictional self often hides from or suppresses our true emotions in an effort to conform to what we imagine are the societal expectations of how we are supposed to feel. This disconnects us from our honest emotions as we present a false front to others. We can become so accustomed to that false front that even we do not comprehend it is a facade. Actually, all of us, on occasion, walk down the road towards the fictional self. There are no exceptions, and that is not always a problem. However, some of us get caught up in a maze of detours that never lead us back to the road of authenticity. To the degree you or I are stuck in a fictional self, make no mistake, this is our problem. But it is not necessarily our fault. It is all too easy for all of us to adopt a fictional self. Our core identity forms while we are quite young. It was while we were unable to corroborate the validity of various conclusions we came to when dealing with external expectations, when dealing with the standards of our caregivers, and our desire to fit in with social groups. These external expectations and standards come from others whose motives are at times self-serving. Therefore, from time to time, we adopt certain behaviors, beliefs, or attitudes that do not align with our authentic self. This dynamic often remains strong in adulthood when it comes to political and religious groups, as well as within certain professional circles. But make no mistake, it is part of all social connections to a degree. Why are there so many domineering and damaging external influences? I do not think we need to ascribe this to malicious intent. You see, none of us starts out in life as experts. Our culture is rich with various competing theories about human nature. Some of them coexist even though they are contradictory. Let me briefly mention some of these naive, well-intended, but mistaken concepts of human nature. From the Christian world, we get the doctrine that people are born sinners. Our unwanted behavior is an expression of our sin nature. To the degree others in your childhood subscribed to this understanding, they acted towards you as if there's something about you that is latently defective. In extreme cases, this became their dominant message to you. From the secular world, there is the notion of the blank slate. According to this notion, you can become anything. Whatever you do become is the result of experiences that wrote upon your blank slate. This is a strange, popular, but unscientific notion of equality. It means well, but it also expects the same nature, capacity, and responsibility out of everyone. If you fail to keep up with your supposed peers, it is your fault. And if you excel above others, it's totally due to your credit in having made superior choices. We also have the noble savage view. In this view, it at least recognizes we struggle with competitive drives. We need to tame the savage in us and nurture the noble being we can be. And this becomes more of a moral theory than just a theory of human nature. Without going into details, however, this view is not without its strengths and weaknesses. There are variations on these themes. Conservatives focus more on personal responsibility. Liberals focus more on fragility, disenfranchising attitudes, and victimization. Both sides tend towards extremes that deny the useful insights coming from the other side. Social groups tend to lack balance. Most people have a hodgepodge amalgamation of various theories about what it means to be human, having never given it much thought. It's not as if we all take the time to develop a disciplined, scientific, and coherent consideration of the matter. Each of these theories rely upon compelling circumstantial evidence. Each of these theories push back on opposing theories, and each of these theories have been both helpful and harmful. Nevertheless, I would argue none of those theories is scientific. There are more theories, but you get the idea. Human nature is whatever it is that defines the statistical range of likely abilities and responses that the human species will manifest in its various situations. But I want to argue that having a precise understanding of what it means to be human is probably not possible, nor necessary. At best, we can be aware of some of these theories and realize that they all speak to something, but they also all take things to an extreme. The maladaptive need for simplicity and certainty may have seduced their formation. Human beings dislike conundrums, and of course, based on genetics and personal history, every individual is a slightly different case in point of human nature. There is no one size fits all. We are not sinners by nature. We are not blank slates. We are not noble savages, nor are we all identical in all human respects. Nevertheless, there is something we could call human nature, even if not well understood. And so, it is no wonder that as we go through childhood, we are influenced at times in unhelpful ways by others who adamantly believe they have it completely figured out. Now, it is true that to get along with others does involve negotiating, compromising, and accommodating the apparent needs of others. We can and often should do that authentically, so long as we are aware that we are negotiating, compromising, and accommodating. The difference is that the fictional self strives to become the person societal expectations require, instead of being ourselves as we negotiate, compromise, and accommodate. Furthermore, this often involves feeling shame over the non-conforming authentic self that might come out of hiding from time to time. We might grow so attached to our facade that the real us feels out of place. The fictional self is born out of a dread, often unrealized, precipitated by the judgments, criticisms, and rejections coming from significant others. We likely fail to realize that while we were young, others had more influence in defining us than we did ourselves. At first, this is unavoidable as children, but as we mature, this is supposed to be something we outgrow. Good parenting and good mentoring gradually let go. As a result, in hidden fear, we modify our behaviors and opinions or our appearance in order to gain acceptance and to avoid negative social consequences. But in so doing, we risk the danger of never getting back to ourselves. As we live inauthentically, we create internally conflicting thoughts about ourselves. This discrepancy between the fictional self and the authentic self can leave us in quiet moments feeling empty, unhappy, and unfulfilled. Well, now that we have unpacked some details about the authentic self and the fictional self, it is important to note that the authentic self and the fictional self exist on a continuum. No one is fully fictional nor altogether authentic. We all navigate through social interactions with a mixture of both, and that mixture will be different in different areas of our lives and with different people. Achieving a greater sense of authenticity in every area and in every relationship would require frequent self-reflection, reestablishing of our self-acceptance, and the courage to take on the unavoidable risks when who we are is not who others want us to be. However, life moves way too fast towards tomorrow so that perfection in this effort to stay authentic is a waste of time. But neither should we abandon that effort. The balance between our authentic individuality and our needful relationships will be an ongoing challenge. Fortunately, we can learn how to do it more effectively. The truth is, we all struggle at times with wanting other people to be who we think they ought to be. We are not just victims. We are also at times the victimizers. Anyone who is authentically themselves is not always fitting in with the expectations of others. Consequently, many familial, social, and professional relational dynamics are actually attempts to change other people, even when we do not realize that is what they are doing to us and what we are doing to them. It is a common illusion that our lives would be better if only other people would change. We humans in our hierarchies unconsciously tend to prefer changing other people rather than negotiating, compromising, or accommodating. Those who are deeply in touch with their authentic selves are comfortable when alone and when in a social setting. In contrast, those who are lost in a fictional self tend to be either strongly identified with various groups or they prefer to stay the hell away from most people as much as possible. One last thing before I move on. No one, not me, not you, none of us are who we could be. We are all how we turned out. How we turned out is a mix of the nurtured, authentic self and the damaged, fictional self. We never see others or ourselves for who we really are. Nonetheless, our actual, unmitigated human dignity resides only in our authentic self. Our fictional self can be quite the unworthy jerk. Okay, so if we are way out of balance and lost deeply in a fictional self, or perhaps only to a problematic degree, how do we discover and reconnect with who we really are? The path to restoring our core identity, to be in alignment with our authentic self, begins by understanding how core identities form in the first place. That will help us understand where things went wrong and how to change that. The authentic self and the fictional self form the exact same way. They use the exact same building blocks. The difference is only in the mistakes made interpreting the events of our lives as to what we think those events say about us. If our interpretation of self is misguided, we embrace a fiction. If our interpretation represents truth, we embrace authenticity. Fortunately, in spite of any damage done to your self-image, the real you has not gone away. It can't. You are still in there. Your authentic self is simply well hidden behind lies you have accepted about yourself, lies you can learn to uncover and discard. Let me take a moment to criticize therapies that try to get people to move beyond and away from the abuse or trauma in the past. I can appreciate the intended help, and this might result in a more adaptive set of attitudes and behaviors, but it just creates a more workable fictional self. No, I'm not going to advocate that you continue to ruminate on all the bad things from the past. Nonetheless, the only true authentic self is based on a positive self-assessment in light of what you have actually been through, after having considered what your past experience truly says about you, honestly, kindly, and redemptively. Now, this is important. Although those lies were born out of overbearing external influences, you embrace them by means of your own interpretations. The lies that constructed your fictional self are your lies. True, they may have originated with others, but your fictional self was constructed by you as you misinterpreted events, decisions, and the influence of others that overwhelmed your ability to more accurately stay in touch with who you really are. What I am saying, and this is important for us to accept, is that external influences certainly became the source material for our fictional self, but none of those external factors caused the damage. The damage to our self-image happened when we validated our misinterpretation and when we believed lies about what our experiences do and do not say about us. Yes, we did this to ourselves, unwittingly. And so it falls on us to identify our self-inflicted fiction and displace it with our self-discovering authenticity. The human brain functions by means of numerous conscious and unconscious innate heuristics that help us interpret reality. These heuristics, hardwired into human nature, also serve to stabilize our interpretations of the significance of everything we attempt to understand. This stability is helpful, but it is not set in stone, and so fortunately, we can remain in ongoing flux and change. We can create changes in our sense of self that restabilize with greater authenticity. Your core identity persists within your habitual thoughts, your habitual focus, without regard to if those habits are fictional or authentic, misguided or responsible. We're dealing with your concepts of how your reality seems to work. And the fictional self is your imagined fatalistic role in life. You took the chain of events in your life and you created an unconscious narrative about you. Insofar as that narrative is of the fictional self, the stability of that narrative functions more like a ball and chain, and it keeps you imprisoned. I cannot say finding your authentic self will be easy or quick for everybody, but I will say you can do it. As I said earlier, not all the dynamics that shape our sense of self are well known or well understood. I do not claim to have a perfect understanding. Nonetheless, we do have a sufficient grasp of certain things that can help us examine some dynamics that shaped our core identity. This will be sufficient. We began arriving at a sense of self very early on. It was long before we ever learned to be scientific or able to verify the accuracy of our methods and conclusions. We learn who we think we are in a manner similar to how we naturally learn anything. We observe and think about what we observe. We go through changes in circumstance and note how those changes worked out for things, for others, or for us. And we interact with others and assess how things are going in those relationships. That is how all human beings initially learn and come to understand everything they ever understand. After such events, changes in circumstance and interactions, we begin to wonder what those observations, changes, and interactions say about us. We then reach rather stable, self-confirming conclusions. So, this is an external and internal process. We observe the external environment. We note modifications of people or things in that environment. And we begin to think of various people as knowing something we do not. This is how we learn to walk, to talk, who others are, and it is also how we discover who it is we think we are. These external factors are a major contributor of information we then process internally to come to our conclusions whenever we feel the need to understand anything. However, I need to say much more about these external factors. Afterwards, I will discuss the internal dynamics. The external dynamics are the building blocks out of which you created your beliefs about you. The internal factors we will discuss later. Those internal factors are tools you use to build your self-concept from those building blocks. So, let us discuss the external factors. We begin by considering general observations. Your life has been a chain of ongoing events in a continual blur. No one can pay attention to all the parameters of everything that is happening. Instead, we learn to focus on what seem to be the most significant factors, and from that subset of information, we assign significance as to what our general observations imply. Our focus might major on minors, or might be on point, but usually it is some mixture of the two. This is how we come to understand the meaning and usefulness of a toy, a car, a house, of all sorts of identifiable objects, and of course, the meaning and usefulness of ourselves. The human brain then has to prioritize these unmanageably innumerable conclusions and observations as to which ones are the most pertinent. We have no ability to remember absolutely everything, and even if we could, not everything is as relevant to what we attempt to understand. And so, every human being reduces all the events of their life to a small selected set that seem to sufficiently and clearly tell them something about who they are. These are some of your most persistent memories. This is your story. It is your personal novel, be it well-written or a sloppy job. It contains a certain brevity, but with attention to detail to include all the required scenes that clearly create your picture of you. And it survives succinctly in about a dozen general observations, a half dozen changes in circumstance, and a half dozen notable influential people. I'm not saying that only a dozen observations defined you, nor am I saying that only 6 or 7 changes in circumstance modified you, nor am I saying that only 5, 6, or 7 people influenced your self-concept. Everything you go through has its impact. What I am saying is that only a subset of general observations, changes in circumstance, and influential people efficiently contain the bulk and summary of all the other additional events. And so, by identifying only a dozen or so major general observed events that you think define you, identifying the half dozen or so major changes in circumstance that make you see yourself the way you do, and identifying the half dozen or so major relationships that shape your sense of self. What I'm saying is that in that reduced subset of it all, we can find almost every aspect of your authentic and fictional self. Simply focusing on this subset of all the events in your life is like creating a well-written novel about you where we get to understand the character you are because the few events we do write about contain an incredible amount of implications. The reduced collection of events contained in your personal story will be the events rich with numerous notions. In other words, if you have come to see yourself as unintelligent, your general observations that come to be retained in your story will not be all the events where you made some absurd mistake. Rather, it will be particular events in which you not only made an absurd mistake, but an event that ended up saying several other things about you as well. Such events, rich in numerous detailed implications, become our most influential memories. We retain as significant those events that we think of as brimming with abundant, meaningful information. For better or worse, fictional or authentic, the events in your life that stand out most to you will be those events from which you can identify numerous things you think are true about you. So, from about a dozen such general observations of the events in your life chain, you will be able to construct a sufficiently thorough narrative about yourself, containing thousands of assumed truths. They are now part of your core identity. As I said, when a gifted novelist tells us about his characters, he finds a clever way to construct events that give us a boatload of insight in just a few scenes. The same is true of your most significant memories. The ones that define you well are the ones full of numerous implications. The bad news is that not all of those events that significantly shape your core identity are fresh in your mind. Some of those events, both positive and negative, whether fictional or authentic, will be repressed but still hold influence on your sense of self. The good news is that by means of a careful review of your life from birth to the present moment, you might be able to uncover and remember several of the most significant events in detail that formed your conclusions about you. You would benefit by attempting a year-by-year review of the various events in your life. This is a process similar to psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. But what if your memory of those events is an inaccurate memory? Well, no doubt, many of our memories are inaccurate, biased by our habit of focus, prior youthfulness, and changed in our repetitious retelling of those events. This does not matter, because it is not the event itself that shaped you, but rather it is your version of what you believed and continue to believe that event says about you. And so, correct or incorrect, your memory of the event is what you will need to work with if you hope to uncover the lies and discover a more authentic message as to what that event honestly says about you. It is also helpful to acknowledge that your version of these events is likely faulty in various ways. And most of those faulty parts of your memory are those parts that help to sustain your fictional self. Your humility in realizing that your memory of events is not entirely accurate is part of what can help you to let go of fictional conclusions based on faulty memories. As life goes on, you acquire new significantly rich events that seem to say many things about you. These new events can displace previous significant events, keeping the total of general observations down to a manageable dozen or so. This resifting of significant events helps us stabilize as well as update our self-image. As we get older, our sense of self modifies from time to time. Additionally, we can also modify our sense of self by re-examining significant events from the past. Doing a genuinely critical reevaluation of those dozen or so general observations will help us arrive at very different conclusions as to what those events do say about you. This means that no matter your age, be it 10 or 110, you will never have to deal with all the events in your life to reconnect with your authentic self. Identifying the dozen most significant events, or at least most of them, and reworking them will send you on an entirely different and more authentic path. This is not only true of general observations, it is also true of the way you have assessed the outcome of various changes in circumstance that somehow affect your sense of self in a significant way. Life goes on as normal, and then comes a divorce. You move to another town. A caregiver dies. You or someone you love has a traumatic experience. Or you win a contest for the first time, get a dream job, or find a hobby you love. Circumstances change. Sometimes it seems to be for the better, and sometimes for the worse. These changes resulted from a decision you or someone else made, or that just seemed to happen. This caused you to see things in yourself, positive or negative, fictional or authentic, and that change in circumstance modified your sense of self. Psychologists and sociologists theorize that about a half dozen such changes in circumstance are part of the memories that powerfully shape what you imagine is the truth about you. Yes, there may be hundreds of such changes, but only a half dozen contain pretty much the whole notion you have acquired about yourself. As was true of general observations, the changes that became most significant are those that were rich with self-identity details. These are the plot twists in your personal novel. Depending on how realistic your conclusions were, those changes in circumstance pushed you deeper into either a more authentic or more fictional set of beliefs about you. These events changed your concept of self, but just as you can reevaluate what your general observations really say about you, so too you can reevaluate the conclusions you came to that were based on those significant changes of circumstance. There's still more. In your life, you have come to know significant people. Again, although many people have influenced you, about a half dozen had a huge impact on numerous ways in how you now see yourself. Most of them are people you knew personally, but some of them could be people you only heard about or witnessed. Most of them would be individuals, but some of them could be a group of people, such as a band, a political party, a church, teachers, or authority figures. These people behaved in such a way, either towards you or merely within your notice, and that caused you to compare and contrast yourself with them in such a way as you came to think it revealed something true about you. Again, it was for better or worse, fictional or authentic. But those half dozen people still affect the way you see yourself. Think of them as the antagonists, heroes, and foilers in your personal novel. Yes, these general observations, changes in circumstance, and significant people affect the way you see yourself. Prior to these observations, changes in circumstance, and awareness of others, you had notions about who you are. Then, after such certain events, you either saw yourself somewhat differently or you more strongly confirmed previous conclusions. And so your sense of self evolves as the chain of moments propel us toward the future. If you were to take the time, and I suggest you do, to identify the dozen or so general observations, the half dozen or so changes in circumstance, and the half dozen or so significant people in your life, you would then be able to write your novel succinctly. This would be the story of you and how you came to believe who you are. You traveled this path, and you can revisit that path to see if that path was accurately, kindly, and usefully understood, or if that path seduced you into believing lies about yourself. This is not as simple as coming up with the 24 memories made up of a dozen general observations and a half dozen each of changes in circumstance and the influence of significant others. You need more than just a list. You will only benefit by thinking about and writing several paragraphs about each event. You'll need to be radically thorough. You need to reconstruct as much detail as you can. You need to relive in your imagination all these moments, and you need to do it repeatedly. These are the building blocks you used to define you. You need to know so much more about those moments in your life than you have ever yet taken the time to consider. Personally, I took about 5 years practicing a relaxation exercise, and while deeply relaxed, I relived numerous events in my life over and over, followed by considering alternative conclusions about what those events do or do not really say about me. Sometimes I relived those events as if they were happening for the very first time. Sometimes I relived those events as if, here we go again. And sometimes I relived those events as if I was a third-party observer. The outcome of those 5 years helped me radically change my sense of self. It was not as if I had a different childhood. It was as if my actual childhood and adult past had a very different impact on me. I came out of that a far more authentic self and left a fictional self in the dust. I did not transcend my past. My past became the inertia that created a more authentic self. I did not bury, move beyond, or deny the fictional damage. I healed the fiction and allowed the authenticity to emerge out of the exact same building blocks that previously damaged me. It may be true that you need to focus on different events in order to emerge authentically, but make no mistake, you must rework the events that currently stand out to you before you can focus elsewhere. Now that we have discussed the external influences that are the basic building blocks of your sense of self, we now turn to the internal dynamics that you use to process those building blocks. Again, it is not as if we understand all of them, but what we do know will be more than sufficient to place us on the path to a more authentic self. Everyone acquires at a young age what we call a locus of control. Locus of control is a concept about how we perceive what primarily causes the outcome of events in our lives. Do we bring about our destiny? Are others more in control? Or is it mere independent destiny or randomness? The truth is that we all contribute to how things turn out. And some things turn out for reasons we cannot identify. But the actions of others at times override our choices, and others determine our circumstances. And of course, some things simply seem to just happen inexplicably. So that is what it is. What is your default explanation for why you live the life you live? Was it you? Was it others? Or did life just happen to you? Actually, it's always a combination, but we all have a tendency to develop an inclination for one of these to be our favorite explanation. Whenever things happen, we can have a strong tendency to assume we know ultimately why. If we major on one of these three perspectives, we will often conclude things like, I am the problem, so I need to be the solution. Or we might assume others are the problem and they need to fix things. Then again, we might assume life is hard and there's nothing you nor I can do about it. There are some people who flip-flop depending on if they are talking about problems or solutions. Everyone messes things up and it falls on me to fix it. Or, I'm always messing things up and I need other people to help bail me out. We're not always honest with our explanations as to why things turn out the way they do. And so, as we reconsider the building blocks discussed earlier, we need to reconsider how our locus of control shaped, authentically or distorted fictionally, our interpretations. A well-adjusted locus of control is realistic and open to a wider, more complex distribution of blame and or credit, according to reasonable considerations. A healthy locus of control can be flexible and, when appropriate, complex. Let us discuss self-talk. Self-talk is quite common, depending on where you research and how careful that research is carried out. There are disagreements as to how common it is. But the majority of self-talk is silent and in the head. It is estimated that about 25% of self-talkers do it aloud. Personally, I think more clearly when alone and express my thoughts out loud. I do not have a lot of internal dialogue, and so when alone I can be quite the gibbering fool. It is in our self-talk that we rehearse and reinforce a narrative about our core identity. Authentic or fictional, it gets rehearsed and reinforced over and over in our self-talk. We need to pay attention to our self-talk. We need to understand clearly where these repeated themes come from. As we note the repetitive themes, we must question their accuracy. Are they inaccurate personal bias confirmation? Do they frequently criticize you, put you down? Or are they narcissistically exonerating? Or maybe the self-talk is nurturing and an upbuilding narration that respects your human dignity. Get familiar with the themes in your self-talk. Next, we need to discuss labeling. Many people, when they discover that we label people in a manner that can be biased and abusive, react by saying, well, let's stop using labels on people. Well, that sounds good at first glance, but that is actually impossible. Human beings cannot think deeply without labels. Every single vocabulary word you know is a label. Linguists would call them signifiers that act as placeholders for a notion that the signifier signifies. This reminds me of a young guitar player who, whenever he made a mistake, would be told by his older peers that if you cannot play it correctly, it is best to not play it at all. He took on the label of being a mediocre guitar player. No. That intimidated this young guitarist, and for decades he never tried to play anything challenging. But he still loved music, loved the guitar, and loved writing songs, so he never totally quit. It took a great deal of encouragement from me and others to get him to experiment with stretching his skills into uncharted waters. The point is that when you are doing something wrong or badly, the best strategy is not to give up right away. Rather, if possible, you should explore how to do those things correctly or better. Embrace the learning curve. Sure, you can give up on things that are no longer meaningful or useful, but do not give up on things that you fail at. Besides, no one needs to be an expert at everything they do. But we do need to pay close attention to the vocabulary words we use to summarize what describes us. Our labels can be authentic, but many of them are, no doubt, fictional. Besides, it being impossible to stop using labels to describe yourself and others, we can only fool ourselves if we think we can abandon using labels. This will only cause our labels to become hidden and unconscious. So, do not try to eliminate labels. That could prove disastrous. If you have a brain, and I hope you want to use it, and hope to think with appropriately complex notions, then you need to learn to use the words you use responsibly. Yes, get rid of bad labels, but the way you do that is to replace them with more realistic and appropriate labels. The labels we use to describe others and ourselves are coping mechanisms. We all need coping mechanisms. There's nothing wrong with having mechanisms that help us cope. What we do not need are maladaptive coping mechanisms. When we are self-aware of the way we label others and ourselves, we need to pay attention to how these labels box them in or box ourselves in. Is the box appropriate and useful in a fair way? Or are we simply coping to avoid uncomfortable risks? Nonetheless, labeling is one of the ways we as human beings stabilize our comprehension of what things mean, including ourselves. Without labels, much meaning would be lost. So understand that you cannot abandon a mistaken meaning or label unless you replace it with a more accurate meaning or label. We now come to fixed beliefs. These are ideas that are so ingrained in our minds that they become thoughtless. You sometimes respond to circumstances automatically without even thinking of the labels or the notions. For example, if several dogs have bitten you, you might develop a fear of dogs. Next time you see a dog, you don't need to rehearse in your mind all the occasions when you got bit. Your reaction is immediate and reflexive. It is very common when we have a damaged sense of self-worth and a powerful assumption about a fictional self that we respond in various situations automatically, based on a fixed belief that is so powerfully and fully assumed that we barely notice what it is that we are assuming to be true. It is simply unquestionably true. These fixed beliefs are not easy to catch. You have to actually go looking for them. Sometimes someone else has to point them out to you. Not all fixed beliefs are bad. Whenever a musician is performing or an athlete is doing what they do well, they are often responding based on learned automatic responses and a fixed belief that they are reasonably competent to this very moment. They do not have to think about it. For example, playing ping pong. The contestant acquires a sense of the current situation and of their abilities. They simply act in the midst of the fast action without taking any time to discuss in their head the options. Fixed beliefs help them act quickly in the current situation with an automatic response. We all have fixed beliefs, and we all need to have them. However, what we really need when it comes to fixed beliefs is a well-developed set of fixed beliefs that are not learned with an inappropriate conclusion about our actual competency or human dignity. Earlier, I discussed self-talk. Some people do not have a high level of self-talk, But such people often rely far more firmly on unconscious fixed beliefs. Because fixed beliefs are hidden, unconscious, and instant, people who do not engage in a lot of self talk can have a particularly difficult time uncovering all their counterproductive fixed beliefs. Now we need to discuss a specific type of fixed belief we can call a limiting belief. Oh, I could never do that, you might say to yourself. No, it is undeniably true that we all have limits, and our sense of these limits is not always absurd. I know I cannot jump 20 feet off the ground using just my legs, but how high can I jump? I do not really know. But it is most likely that the limit is somewhere between how high I can currently jump and possibly just a little bit more. So I'm not going to say you have no limits and you can do anything you put your mind to, but I will say this, that within reason, no one really knows the difference between what they have as real limits and what they simply have never done yet. Your limiting beliefs may be appropriately cautious, or they could be artificial impediments, keeping you from acquiring or perfecting certain meaningful skills. I think it is healthy to be aware of our sense of limits, but we need to realize that a number of them should be questioned. We also need to be open to the possibility of exceeding what we thought of as our limits. Another way we humans stabilize in the fictional self or the authentic self is through our embracing of certain social constructs, such as roles. How am I to behave as an employer or an employee, as a child, as a parent, as a husband, as a wife, as an authority figure? Or we could mention an entire catalog of roles people find themselves in. We define most of these roles through cultural expectations, and these social constructs may or may not be equitable, fair, or the best way of organizing things needed to be done. And what is true of all social constructs is that they are all a bit too narrow in scope. Most social constructs are shaped by people more powerful than you, and they are shaped in order to keep the powerful in power. We cannot upend everything, or nothing functions. However, we do need to question various roles as to if they are simply traditional and not actually relevant to modern times. Many traditions from the past were born out of necessity as determined by the knowledge and technology available at that time. But as technology and knowledge advance, roles must change and modify based on those advancements. Social constructs do not change overnight, but they do change, and not always for the better. So you may need to pick your battles, and so many cultural assumptions need to die, being replaced with updated, carefully worked out social constructs that reflect current appropriate options. There are many ways we as humans stabilize our sense of self. They all work pretty much the same, regardless of if they sustain a fictional self or an authentic self. Nonetheless, they all can benefit from some clear challenges. Not all of the ways we as humans stabilize our sense of self are well known or understood. So you may discover additional ways I have not mentioned, and you could benefit from putting all of them to some sort of authenticity test. But there is one last idea I need to impress upon you. As I mentioned earlier, we human beings are often uncomfortable with conundrums and uncomfortable with the unknown. This discomfort seduces us into making hasty and unjustified assumptions, adopt labels, engage in fictional self-talk, and rely on other cognitive practices intended to give us a false sense that we have things figured out more than we actually do. we struggle to accept that there are some things we really do not know, and that there are some things we may never know. For example, we do not know and understand everything involved in the forming and reshaping of our core identity. We know enough to make definite progress. However, a good strategy for avoiding more of a fictional self is to accept with comfort that what we do know is often highly theoretical, and the reality that we have no idea how much we do not know. That's unavoidable. We may still be mistaken about a great number of things, and even in rediscovering our authentic self, this can involve layers wherein the authenticity we have recovered is merely partial, with more to come later. Be cautious in the story you tell to explain your lot in life. Be open to discovering just how mistaken you might be. But of course, do this with care to not allow others to talk you into an understanding that you simply cannot relate to at the moment. They might even be right, but their correct notions about you cannot help you until you can see them authentically for yourself. You do not need to remain forever in the unknown or in a conundrum. But the way out of unknown territory is to discover possibilities you hold on to loosely. The way out of conundrums is to embrace them until a clear resolution arrives in an uncontroversial and unforced way. But we need to accept the reality that many conundrums may never be resolved, and we need to be okay with that. If we're not okay with that, we will certainly slide into a fiction. I hope that this chat has been helpful in giving you a better understanding of how you came to think of yourself the way you do. With that understanding, you're now better equipped to follow through with the hard and time-involved re-evaluation of your core identity. The only way to wash out the fiction is to replace it with authenticity and dignity. My last word of advice is this: just as you can do this for yourself, take the time to reorganize how you think of others. Your view of others is also a mixture of fiction and authenticity. Doing this for yourself and for others is a pathway to a more nurturing and loving culture. Thank you for listening. I'm Bob Greaves, and this has been Living with Wisdom.